James Allen is the Garrick Professor of Law at the University of Queensland. Native-born Canadian, Jim has practiced law in a large Toronto law firm and then at the bar in London. He has taught law in Hong Kong, New Zealand, Canada and Australia.
I want to outline what I think are the three main types of political correctness. But the first and most important sort of political correctness, or for me anyway, the most dangerous type, here's how an American pundit defined it. And again, I think this is just one sort of political correctness, but he said, political correctness refers to the resistance from descriptions of reality because of the way they may be perceived by groups to whom our elites have decided to be hypersensitive. So the idea is that certain well-placed elites in society take particular subjects off the table. They limit what is seen to be acceptable in polite company, or what is acceptable to talk about in polite company. And the topics that get taken off the table are ones that involve a hypersensitivity to the feelings of certain groups in society. Not all groups. You can say pretty much anything you like about Christians or paint anything you like about Christ, but different rules apply to, say, Islam. So what is acceptable there is much more constrained. So with this first sort of political correctness, you're almost talking about a group right not to be offended, but it's only for a favored few groups. So the problem with political correctness in my first form is it limits, to some extent, what you can say, at least about certain favored groups. They don't have to have as thick a skin as the rest of us. And in fact, political correctness leads people to censor themselves to some extent. And it gnaws away at free speech. So I've said this plenty of times, but I'll say it again. The only kind of free speech that I think matters is the kind that protects offensive speech. If you have a protection of free speech that amounts to protecting speech that we all want to hear, you know, the kind of speech that you can just imagine us all sitting around in circles, we're holding hands, Oliver's playing the guitar, and we're all singing Kumbaya, that's worthless. Protecting that kind of speech is worthless because we all agree. The only kind of protections for free speech that matters are kinds that people don't want to hear, that offend people. So it's precisely that sort of free speech, I think, that this first strand of political correctness gnaws away at. And it's important that you recognize that. I think that's the most important strand. Now, if you want egregious examples of this, there's lots of them. The Andrew Bolt trial here in Australia, because often this is linked to, I think, hate speech laws that overreach. In Canada, there's loads more examples, because one of the things I'll say at the end is that Australia probably is less politically correct. Well, I know it's less politically correct than Canada, New Zealand, and I would probably say the US too. But we're going in the wrong direction. At any rate, in Canada, there's examples of Mark Steyn. Most of you will know that. Ezra Levant. There's a great one that I like. There's a Canadian stand-up comedian. His name's Guy Earle. True story. He was practicing his profession, which is stand-up comedy. In the course of one of his acts, two women started to heckle him. He started making jokes at the two hecklers about their being lesbians. Bad luck for him, they were. He got taken to court. He had to pay a big fine. He basically hasn't worked since. You see, in Canada, apparently you can't mock lesbians who pay to come to your show and who heckle you. You can't respond to that. There's lots of more serious examples in Europe. Gert Wilders, Lars, excuse my pronunciation, Hedegaard. There's a Viennese mother, Elizabeth Savage-Wolf. You'll hear from some others. The only thing that drives these prosecutions really is the perceived insult. You know, usually the defendant is barred from proving the truth of the statement. That's what happened with Mark Steyn. He couldn't prove in court that what he said was true, which is bizarre. And I can only hope that a future government here in Australia repeals that awful Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. Look, lots of people say things that we don't agree with that are awful, but you just have to suck it up sometimes. You don't have to go and read John Stuart Mill to realize that there's a lot. I mean, the best justification for free speech is if you believe that in the competition of ideas, you move forward. And that means you have to hear things you don't agree with and you find offensive. So that's what I'd say is strand number one of political correctness. A less important strand, but one that's, you know, out there for sure, so it also gets labeled political correctness, has to do with what I call regulatory overkill. Think of health and safety regulations or rules, or an over-obsession with equality. So now you can think of all the over-the-top government regulations to do with school playgrounds, risk assessment forms. You know, in the university, you have to fill out 8 forms to do anything. Warning signs that you're about to drink hot coffee. Police directives in the UK about how to eat your lunch. There's all the tort law idiocies that come out of the U.S. My personal experience, because I lived 11 years in Dunedin until I moved over here 6 years ago. So my son, who was 11 when we moved over, you only have to say the word All Blacks, and he puts on a black shirt and is hoping for the All Blacks, otherwise really Australian. But the one that really has struck me and continues to strike me is when you lived in New Zealand and roadworks were being done, you would have the team of people actually doing the roadworks, jackhammers, everything, and there might be one orange cone 5 feet in front of the work. I moved to Australia, and what I discovered is you can't actually do roadworks without an Iraq War army of safety officers, lights, people directing traffic, 5 or 6 IR consultants. It's unbelievable. I still can't get over it, that there's more people directing the traffic than actually doing anything. That is not the way it works. So that's an example on the health and safety front. I'm sure you all have your own. On the over-obsession with equality, here's a good example. It's a very recent one, the European Court of Justice. Recently, and this is binding on the UK, I feel sorry for the UK, teenage girls, they decided, have to pay the same for car insurance as teenage boys. The facts of life, or at least the overwhelming actuarial evidence of who drives better, being totally irrelevant. You see, it prompted one critic in the UK to say about this ruling that these judges and lawyers have become so infatuated with the concept of anti-discrimination in the abstract that they really can't distinguish between Nazis and actuaries. So that's another kind of political correctness, the kind that we laugh about. It's not as serious as the first kind that stifles free speech. That leaves me just a bit of time then to move on to strand 3. This is the third sin that usually or often attracts the label political correctness. And I sort of summarize it as the rise of the humorless, po-faced neo-prudes. You know, people who can't laugh at anything, and they don't want anyone else to either. Latter-day Puritans, we see them in Parliament, we see them in the newspapers, we see them throughout the ABC. You know, they're basically today's version of Cromwell's Roundheads. Let me tell you a true story. I'm going to say it even though it's on camera. It happened to me 2 or 3 years ago. I was picking up my son from school. He was in year 10. He just finished cricket practice, and by the way, I do brag to people I'm the only Canadian on the planet who knows how to score cricket. You have to do something on those Saturdays when you're there. So anyway, I was picking him up for cricket practice in year 10, and he gets in the car, and as we're driving home, he says, "Dad, do you know what a stereotype is?" And I said, "I think so. Why do you ask?" And he said to me, "Dad, how do you know it's an Asian who's broken into your house?" And I said, "I have no idea." He said, "Dad, you get home, your homework's done, the dog's missing, and the thief is still trying to back out of the driveway." Now, this is what a teacher at my son's school used to start a discussion about stereotypes. If you don't think that's a fantastic way for a teacher to introduce a discussion about stereotypes, why they develop, why they've always been around, how they can mislead, not least because teenagers respond to humor in a way they don't respond to preaching and puritanical, certitudes from on high, it would never, ever, ever have happened in Canada. It was one of the great things. I was never moving my son from that school once it happened because kids are pretty astute in some ways. They just don't respond to being preached at. So I think humor can be a victim of political correctness too, and in fact, it is. I think there's a sort of poser moralism out there, the sort of bumper sticker moralizing, where you're trying to exhibit your superior moral antenna. And the second factor I think that's sometimes underplayed is fear. And the good example of that is with the Danish cartoons about Muhammad, and the absolutely spineless response that was exhibited after that by the press around the world. Now look, they knew that a very small slice of Muslim extremists sometimes deliver on their threats. They do actually create murderous mayhem. So in response to the Danish cartoons, these newspapers, not all of them, but the vast preponderance, took the path of least resistance. Now, my view, and I'm sort of a subject of my upbringing, but I went to a state school in Toronto, and I soon learned that there's one proper response to bullying. It's when you stand up and you cause the person, you go down fighting. You make the stakes so high, you're going to do nothing else but look the person in the face. You might lose, but you're going to go down fighting. It's the only response to bullying. I think that every newspaper in the world, papers that would never have dreamed of publishing these cartoons, never, having been threatened, the proper response is for every single one of those papers to have put the cartoons on the front page. That would have been the end of it. There would be no more threats. That's how you respond to bullying. It is not by weak, vacillating, fear-driven responses. So although there's a certain poser moralism here that motivates a lot of this first kind of PC-ness, fear is also a factor, I think. The over-obsession with personal safety, that sort of political correctness, the kind that we laugh about, if you ever get, I don't know if anyone subscribes to The Week, but The Week lists all the idiocies in Britain every week. And it's that sort of PC-ness they always talk about, the health and safety kind. Well, I just think some people prefer to dwell in this warm, fuzzy world of moral abstraction. So it's all about personal safety. Nobody ever stops to ask hard questions like, well, if we do a cost-benefit analysis, is it really better to make people wear helmets when they ride bicycles? It's not at all clear that it is. When you weigh it all up and you factor in obesity and health and all sorts of things, admitting that once every, I don't know, 400,000 or 500,000 times not wearing a bicycle helmet might cause problems, might kill somebody, but nobody wants to ask those sort of questions, and you end up with this mania for zero tolerance, which actually can have bad long-term consequences. The third strand of constraining what we can laugh about, I reckon just some people are born without a sense of humor. I don't know what else to say. They don't want anyone else to laugh because they can't. And, I don't know what else to say. You've got your cavaliers and you've got your roundheads. Now, this takes us to why this all needs to be fought. It's just a fact, I think, that on questions like, what are we going to do about the Ground Zero Mosque, or what are we going to do about border control policies, or gay marriage, or coal-fired power stations in Australia? It's just not true to think that one side of the argument has some sort of pipeline to God and their moral sentiments quiver at just the right frequency, and the other people are all racist, sort of substandard human beings. The fact is that in any population of tens of millions of people, you just have honest disagreement between smart, reasonable, nice people. That's a sensible way to see the world. An unsensible way to see the world is to think, after 4 billion years of evolution, I am the one whose moral sentiments are always right, and everyone who disagrees with me is defective, which is what you hear again and again from a lot of people. They don't really put it that way, but that's honestly what they're thinking. I'm sure you've tuned into the ABC on occasion. You'll get the sense. So the demands of political correctness are such that this becomes the sort of default explanation for disagreement. It's pathetic.